After designing and building cutting boards for years, I decided I wanted to try something a little more challenging.
Things are about to get real.
Hey everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how I made this amazing flag cutting board. I'll go over the materials that I used, the steps for assembling this complex design, and also share my experiments with doing star inlay. Alright, let's go. So to get started, I'm going to need 3 separate species of lumber. For the white stripes, I'm going to use hard maple. For the red stripes, I'm going to use padauk. You could also use bloodwood. It's a darker red end grain. I like to use padauk because it's a nice bright red. And for the union where the stars go, I'm going to use purple heart. So to begin, I need to cut all this lumber to rough length. And for some reason, my lumber dealer only had padauk in 3-inch wide boards. But for this application, that's to my advantage because 3-inch wide boards will give some visual interest to the final product. I'm cutting these pieces to 12.5 inches, which is all I need for one board. And now my saw looks like it's been eating flaming hot Cheetos. I'm going to cut the maple board slightly smaller at 11 inches since there's one less white stripe than red. And the purple heart gets cut to 9-inch pieces. One of the reasons I love this project so much is because I get to work with these amazing colored tropical hardwoods, which isn't something I get to do in my projects very often. And the fact that they're extremely dense and hard makes them perfect for this application. Next, I head over to the table saw because I want to cut all this maple down so that it matches the width of the padauk. This way there'll be consistency to the grain pattern across the cutting board. And then I need to joint the edges of all these boards. That's going to help me eliminate any gaps in my glue-ups that would show through in the final board. I need to be careful not to remove too much of the thickness of these boards because I'm going to have more milling to do on these later. One of the nice things about all 3 of these wood species is they mill really nicely and leave crisp, sharp edges. The final step is to rip these at the table saw so the opposite edge is parallel to the jointed edge. That's it for milling. Now it's time for glue up number 1. I sure hope you like glue ups because this project has a lot of them. To put these together, I'm using a water-resistant glue and I just used the old built-in glue spreader to apply. I like gloves here because there's nothing worse than getting your gluey fingers covered in sawdust and you end up with a club for a hand. I'm lining these boards up side by side to make 24-inch panels that are only a few inches long. This is going to introduce a unique obstacle that I'm going to have to solve for once these dry. And here's a quick tip for dealing with tropical woods. Most of these species contain oils that can rise to the surface if they've been sitting a while. It's best to remove that oil from the surface with alcohol or acetone before you glue up your boards since the oil may not play nicely with the water-based wood glues. I've personally never experienced a glue failure due to this, but I also tend to do my glue ups soon after the milling process, which removes that surface material anyways. So it's been a few hours and my panels are now out of the clamps and dry, and it's time to mill them to a consistent thickness of 7/8 of an inch. Now for the purple heart panel, I'm going to take care of that on the planer, but for these other 2 panels, I've got a problem. The grain is running perpendicular to the cutter head, so I can't send these through the planer because it could potentially damage the panel and damage the planer, so I'm going to have to rely on my drum sander to get these down to the right thickness. The drum sander is one of those tools that you don't have to use very often, but it's absolutely key in a project like this where a planer is far from ideal and a hand sander can't guarantee you a consistent thickness. For this step, you could risk tear out and send these through the planer, but there are steps later on in this build where you absolutely can't use a planer, and so you might as well play it safe and go ahead and use the drum sander now. One thing to always remember is that when using the drum sander, you've got to go much slower than if you were using a planer. So I just have to be patient and remove a small amount each pass, and soon enough I'll hit my desired thickness. Next I need to cut a straight edge along one of the long sides to reference against the table saw fence. And now I'm going to take all that hard work and cut it to ribbons. Well, stripes actually. I'm cutting each panel into 1 5/8 inch strips. My final board thickness is set to 1.5 inches, so this is going to give me 1/8 of an inch of wiggle room, which I'll use later. Now I just need to arrange all my strips into stripes. I'm placing the end grain facing up and alternating red and white stripes. I'm also getting a glimpse at how awesome this board is going to look in the end. And now I'm dividing the stripes into an upper and lower section, and then also staggering the strips so that the glue joints on the boards don't line up perfectly. This will create a more interesting look. And now we've arrived at glue up number 2, and this one's a doozy. 13 strips to glue up. Well, almost. I need to leave the joint between the third white stripe from the bottom and the red stripe just above it with no glue. This will give me the upper and lower stripe sections to assemble later. I need to be sure to glue these as flat and straight as possible. Ingrain strips can bend pretty easily under the force of clamps, and so you can end up gluing an arc into the board. I do the same thing for the purple heart to create the union for the flag, and these just need to sit now for a few hours to cure. Alright, so it's the next day and the second glue up is out of the clamps, and I now have 3 separate parts that are going to make up this board. I went ahead and cleaned up any of the excess glue squeeze out that was still remaining on here, and I just used a scraper for that. And now it's time to send these parts back through the drum sander to get them all to a consistent thickness again. After that, we're going to trim everything up and get it ready for assembly. Alright, so now that all our parts are ingrained, the drum sander is a must-have tool once again. I need to get all 3 of these parts to the exact same thickness. So I run them all through and adjust the height and then run them all through again. This is why I made the strips an extra 1/8 of an inch wide to give me room to do this step. One thing about these tropical woods is that they burn easily, so you got to make sure to go slow and keep the sanding drum cleaned often. To keep it clean, I use a sanding disc cleaning stick. It's like a magic eraser for clogged sandpaper. Once everything is sanded to the same thickness, I can cut off the ragged edges with my track saw. I'm not cutting them the final length just yet because there's more assembly to come. Now I have 2 sections of this board that fit together perfectly, and man, don't they look so awesome already? So clean and bright. But you may have noticed something is missing. I've got to make room for the union, which means that I need to cut this short so that I can glue these 2 pieces together, and then once those are together, I can come back and add the 3rd piece to make the complete cutting board. So before I do the final assembly, I'm going to go ahead and do the star inlay on the union. It's better to do this step now before it becomes part of the cutting board, because if I did it later on in the process and I wasn't happy with the inlay, I'd have to cut the union carefully out of the board, remake this, and then put it back in, and that just sounds like an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of it now, make sure I'm good with the inlay, and then do the final assembly. Once I've got my toolpath sent to the CNC, it's time to cut. I like to stick my workpiece to the CNC with 2-sided tape. This is my favorite way to attach my work to the machine because it holds so well and it doesn't get in the way of the bit as it cuts. So with my 60-degree V-bit, I'm going to cut the negative space into the union. This will be where the inlay goes. This part of the process goes fairly quickly as this is a pretty simple V-carve. Now for the inlay. I made up this blank out of maple ingrain and attached it to a scrap of plywood to raise it up high enough so that the bit won't hit my fence. Cutting the inlay is a much longer process. I think this one took about 3 hours. And it starts with a straight bit hogging out the majority of the waste around the stars. Part of what takes so long is that I need to use a 1/8 inch bit because there's a lot of detail between all these stars. But once that is done, I switch back over to the same 60-degree V-bit and I cut the stars. What I'm cutting here is the exact mirror image of the design that I carved in the union, which will allow me to then flip this over and fit it exactly into the negative space. With the inlay finally cut, I need to rip off the waste edges at the bandsaw. And next comes glue up number 3. I add a dab of glue into each of the 50 stars and then make sure to spread that glue out into all those star points to make sure that I have complete glue coverage. It's tedious but super important, otherwise you might have a corner of a star pop out down the road. Then I can just flip the negative over and add as many clamps as I can. The key here is getting even clamping pressure to all the stars. I use 4 parallel clamps because they cover a lot of area. I'm also using a wrench here not because I'm cranking down on the clamps, but because I didn't have room to get my hand in to turn the grip of the clamp. Even with those 4 clamps, there's still room to add some smaller clamps. Like I said, get as many on there as you can. And now we wait and hope for a good result. All right, so it's been about 8 hours in the clamps, and that's absolutely as long as I can wait. I'm super anxious to get in here and see what this inlay looks like, especially nervous because I am using a new CNC for this cut, as well as not quite remembering what size V-bit that I like to use when I make these inlays. I don't really know what this looks like. So to remove the waste, I could throw this back on the CNC and use an end mill to remove all of this waste and get down to the inlay. But really it's quicker and faster to just use a bandsaw to do it. And if you look here, I have about 1/8 of an inch kerf gap there between the waste material and the finished piece, and that is by design. That will allow me to get a bandsaw blade right through there and zip this waste right off. So let's get to it. I just line the blade up with that gap and begin the cut. I'm taking it slow so that the blade doesn't wander back into my workpiece. And with my square standing in as a push stick, the big reveal. Well, all right, so far so good. I don't see anything here yet that's giving me any concerns, but the real test is to send this back through the drum sander so I can get rid of the remaining waste and glue that's on here and get down to the fine details of the inlay. So something just happened with my drum sander. I think something fell out of calibration. Not 100% sure what just happened, but it completely burnt the edge of my inlay and kind of gouged it out a little bit here on the edge. Upon further review, what happened with the drum sander is the paper came off of the drum, it slipped off, doubled up on itself, and that's what caused the major gouge on the board. So I was able to replace that paper and get the drum sander working again and continue on with the flattening. The good news is this looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how the inlays have turned out. They look nice and crisp. One thing is some of the points on the stars are a little more rounded than I would typically like, but I don't think that that detracts from it at all. It's just not exactly crisp, but the real issue here is this deep gouge. Can I sand this down enough to get it reflat and get rid of that gouge? I just don't know that there's enough inlay material inside of this to be able to withstand sanding down that far, but I'm gonna give it my best shot. Chances are I'm probably gonna have to redo this. Well, I was right. I couldn't save this one. The stars started to become different sizes, so this one is a fail. The good news is I made another one, this time using a 30-degree V-bit, and I'm much happier with the crisp corners on the stars. And with new paper in the drum sander, this inlay finished up perfectly. After that, I just trimmed it to length. With the inlay complete and looking great, I'm going to cut the top stripe section to make room for the union. Now I can do glue up number 4 and attach the union to the top section of stripes. I'm gluing it with the inlay facing down so I can ensure that the face of the board is flush. Once that comes out of the clamps, I can do the 5th and final glue up of this board and add the bottom stripes. I'm paying extra attention to these last 2 glue ups to make sure that everything is seamless and even. At this point, I don't have a lot of room left to sand, and so I don't want to take too many passes through the drum sander. This last sanding is where the drum sander is most important. With these super small inlays, I need to be able to remove tiny bits of material at a time, and even if you were brave enough to put an ingrain board through your planer, you definitely wouldn't want to do it with these delicate inlays in there. Now I just give the board a good sanding with 80 grit paper first to remove any of the scratches made by the drum sander, and then go all the way up to 220 grit. Then I just knocked off the corners of the board using a disc sander and this handy little right angle jig that I made. I also make sure to clean up the edges with a block plane. Using a block plane here is a much better option than a router because running a router bit across all this end grain has a really high chance of tear out and ruining this amazing board right at the very end of the project. Alright, to complete the finishing, I spray the board with water to raise the grain. And then I can knock that back down with a 220 grit again. Now comes the big payoff, the part that makes all this work and attention to detail worth it. Look at that color. I just love how the colors come alive when the oil hits it. I'll keep applying this mineral oil until the board doesn't soak any more in. Then I wipe off the excess and apply a paste made of mineral oil and beeswax. You can buy this stuff from lots of places, or you can make your own. I have a video on my channel for how I make mine, so make sure to check that out if you want to know how to save some money and make your shop smell amazing. And after the paste wax sits on the board for a couple of hours, I buff it out with a clean cotton t-shirt until it has a soft glowing sheen. And that's how you make an amazing flag cutting board with star inlays. All right, well, this thing is amazing, and I hope you guys really enjoyed this video, and I hope that you learned something new along the way. If you have any other questions, please go ahead and leave those in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer those for you. And also make sure to give me a thumbs up and hit that logo icon to subscribe to the channel. I would love to have you on board. And I've got some other cutting board videos that are lined up here that I think you guys would really enjoy, so make sure that you check those out. And until next time, have fun in the shop.